All right, welcome back to another episode of Phoenix Edge. This is an RPG and gaming news podcast. My name is Hat.
And I'm Eric.
And today we have a lot of but I should say viewer suggested topics. A lot of real good and interesting ones. But first and foremost, the biggest topic of them all. This actually kind of broke about the next day after we released our podcast, so we were kind of bummed out we didn't get to talk about it in the last podcast. But in a recent interview,
we really got to push our podcast like a day or two after. Apparently all the good stuff happens on that day.
On Monday and Tuesday?
Yeah.
Makes sense. But apparently apparently this actually did occur. Sakaguchi, Katase, and Nobuo, they all sat in a room together. This had not occurred in like 10 years. They talked about all sorts of stuff, mostly Final Fantasy VII. And Nobuo may have inadvertently spilled the beans on the fact that the Final Fantasy VII Remake was supposed to come out this year. So that's pretty crazy. We're going to talk about that. And then we also have from Dude McGuy, he's basically going to make the case of whether or not the decline of the Final Fantasy series was really such a bad thing. Now, he's kind of impartial on this question, but he thinks it would be a good topic to talk about. Then we have from Silverbox Music, he's asking about our favorite JRPG soundtracks. So we're going to kind of rank them. Well, I'm not sure we're going to rank them, but we're going to just throw some ones out there and why we like them. And then we have from Cerez Cypher, he's going to comment on some of our discussion points last week where we were kind of talking about Xenoblade Chronicles, and he's going to be giving his thoughts with that game and kind of referencing some of the points we made in our previous discussion video, and then also kind of giving his own opinions on why he didn't really appreciate the game as much as some other people. And then we have BioPhoenix. He's asking about horror-themed RPGs. In particular, would we like to see more of them? And then finally, Leanne. She comes in with her thoughts on why she would like to see a Game Boy Classic. But before we get into any of those topics, Eric, what have you been playing this week?
Nothing too much. Diablo, I decided to get back into Diablo 3 again to how things have turned out, and I'm very impressed. The game it's a rock solid game. The mechanics feel smooth. The dungeon crawling aspects are fun. The story isn't like the most engaging thing ever, but it's very well presented. It's very well executed. I feel like the intense moments are very intense, and I generally liked all the characters.
Yeah.
And I actually just finished the main campaign of the main campaign and then like the expansion campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's just opened up in adventurers mode for me, which I'm not 100% sure of what it is yet. My friend that's been playing with me says that it's really fun and it's like where the real meat of the game is. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm only level 55 out of 70, but it is something I'm actually interested in playing the end game, since FF14 you can only do but so much till you gotta wait for the next patch.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna spend some time in that. I'm debating on getting Red Dead Redemption 2 next week if the budget allows it. But I think that's next week. It's sometime in October it's coming out.
It's coming out, yeah.
But that's really been the main thing for me. I've been having a blast with it. You can technically try it for free. I don't know how much access they give you for free on Diablo 3, but you can just download it and start playing it if you want to. But if you want to just buy the whole thing, I think it's like $30 for the whole shebang on battle.net.
So I played the complete version, maybe at the time, on the PlayStation 4 with a friend of mine. I went all the way through it, but that was the last time I had played it. So it's interesting that you decided to just jump into this game, but I guess you had a friend kind of sparring you on, so that makes sense.
Yeah, he's got a couple level 70s already, so
yeah,
I mean, he's way ahead of me on the spectrum. But I know online games enough, so I'm sure I can catch up just fine.
Yep. And do you plan on picking up the Switch version soon?
No, that's I've heard that the game works surprisingly well on PS4 and Xbox One, like with the controller, but That's kind of a game that's kind of like a PC mouse and
Yeah,
keyboard type deal for me. Like it works
yeah,
perfectly fine with controllers, and people like the console versions more. That's perfectly fine. But those are one of the rare times where I'm like, I prefer the PC over the console.
for sure. It definitely lends itself to PC gaming, I feel. I did enjoy it on the PlayStation 4 for what it's worth, but I definitely think it's more geared towards some mouse action for sure, some mouse and keyboard. But I've been blasting much more through Final Fantasy, or excuse me, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest 11.
Dare mix those two together.
I know I can't, even though they're made by the same company now, but yeah, they're totally different. So I've been going through Dragon Quest 11 some more. I'm, it's a roller coaster. I find myself enjoying it. I find myself getting upset at a plot point or two, or in general, some design choices. But in general, I've been having a real good time with it. I think that's probably going to be our next discussion video. So,
okay,
I think I have a lot of good stuff to bring up about it. So, but anyways, I don't want to put it all out here and spoil the game for anyone that hasn't played it. Just go pick it up and get ready for that. That way, you all can give your thoughts on what you think as well. But let's move on to our first topic of the day. So Nobuo Uematsu, he kind of spilled the beans on the fact that the Final Fantasy VII Remake was supposed to come out. So basically, it was Nobuo, Katase, and Sakaguchi. It looks like they're at an airport. I don't know. The whole thing looked kind of staged, but they ended up having a round table type discussion, and I can't remember the guys' names, but I think they work for Square Enix. But they're kind of interviewing all three of them, and there's a lot of very interesting stuff regarding the Final Fantasy VII game, some of the past history, and they got into the discussion of the recent Bra Bra concert. Now, one of the things that Sakaguchi asked while they were talking about it prompted Nobuo to basically say the game was supposed to come out in 2018, but Sakaguchi said, why was that concert only Final Fantasy VII music? And prior to this, they were talking about Katase and Nobuo were kind of laughing, going back and forth, like that they had to play this flute on stage and they had to make an appearance at the concert. So that's why Sakaguchi was just like, why was this only Final Fantasy VII music? Like, why weren't you doing other games? And Nobuo paused, and then he says something, and you just hear beeping, like black goes over his mouth, and Katase is just like, whoa, whoa, and he's like putting an X up. And apparently people that were there have come out and said, Nobuo said the game was supposed to come out this year. That's why it was only Final Fantasy VII music. Nobuo has said something previously like that on Twitter. Someone found where he said the game was supposed to come out, or could come out in 2018. So I don't know.
It's not surprising at all, because I mean, these companies always have projected dates ahead of time. Like Final Fantasy Versus 13 was supposed to come out a year or two after 13.
Yeah.
And that got pushed all the way back to the end of 2016.
Yeah.
So, I think the one thing that makes it feel a bit different this time is that I think they really planned or dead set on the 2018 release. I think once upon a time they felt confident enough to get Uematsu to start a concert for it.
Yeah, I mean, that was well, if anyone's familiar with our channel, we do have a kind of a video relating to the music that they did for that concert series. And one of the big things that we were kind of looking at that point in time was, look at the timing of this event, right? You have Katase appearing at Final Fantasy VII concerts, which is something like, how often is this a regular thing that Katase's appearing at concerts? It's a very strange thing, right? And then Nobuo's suddenly supervising this reorchestration of Final Fantasy VII music, and then it comes out around that time that Katase says, well, yeah, Nobuo was working on the soundtrack. You know, all these things are happening at the same time, and then now we find out, well, these concerts were occurring because it makes sense. Final Fantasy VII was supposed to come out. I mean, this makes sense though, because if it was going to come out this past year, then that would have been the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy VII. And this year, or excuse me, the past year, I think it was the 30th anniversary. So, I mean, like this makes perfect sense timing wise for the game to have come out and planned for that. It's kind of suggestive, though, the fact that those concerts were going on and that was the purpose for them. The fact that as of a year and a half ago, like the game was still possibly slated to come out now. I mean, I don't know. Like it makes you wonder at what point did this officially get pushed back. I guess we can kind of speculate, you know, around the CyberConnect 2 timeframe. They had to suddenly hire a bunch of people. We saw the job postings and everything like that. But, you know, it is some interesting information regardless.
I do wonder when in 2018 that it was intended, because Kingdom Hearts 3 was supposed to come out winter 2018. That just got pushed back a month to 2019. But originally it was supposed to come out in late 2018. So were they going to release that in 7 around the same time, or was 7 going to come out earlier than that? Like, were they going to let two major products clash with each other, competing with themselves? I don't know.
Yeah,
it
because
sounds a bit weird.
That's a good point, because a lot of people criticize the fact that World of Final Fantasy, which obviously is not as big as Kingdom Hearts 3 or Final Fantasy 7 Remake, but that came out around the same time frame as Final Fantasy 15, and a lot of people felt like the sales were actually kind of hurt by that, you know. So I mean, that's a good point. Would you really want 7 Remake and Kingdom Hearts 3 coming out at the same time, or within, you know, a couple of months of each other? I mean, I'm sure they would have pushed one of them back, one or the other, you know.
Yeah, but then again, World of Final Fantasy is ultimately aimed at a younger audience, and Final Fantasy essentially sells itself, and so does Kingdom Hearts to that extent. But having both both they came out in the same month, you have someone deciding if they want a new Kingdom Hearts game or a new Final Fantasy game, which I don't think is the best idea. You want them to want a Kingdom Hearts game and then later down the line want a FF7 game, or they play the long run. But I don't know. I have a feeling that FF7 was just like destined to be delayed.
Yeah, I will. Absolutely. The thing is, I'm not sure if they really envisioned this much of a delay, right? I'm assuming, like, when you said, I wonder at what point during 2018, if Kingdom Hearts 3 was still slated for its Christmas release, roughly that time frame, which now it's coming out in January, I would assume maybe 7 Remake, maybe like the summertime. I don't know. But, you know, if you look at the events of how this whole thing unfolded, they initially had a third party working on the game, basically developing the game. You know, there was all these reports coming out that the progress was just booming. At one point, Katase actually said most of the vocal work was complete, and that was like 2016, late 2016. So, I mean, the game was just plowing in development, and when they actually pulled it back from CyberConnect 2, it definitely does seem like they 100% just almost scrapped everything they had before and started over. And that's the only thing I can get from this, because if it was supposed to come out in 2018 and we haven't seen any other footage in 2 years, something like that, besides like an occasional screenshot, that tells me for sure that it's going to come out on the PS5, right? If it was coming out in 2019, we would have seen something. I would feel like, if it was going to have a 2019 release date, unless they're just waiting for Kingdom Hearts 3 to come out.
Yeah, I still think there's going to be a PS4/5 version. I don't think they're going to just completely just skip the console.
I would not take that completely off the table. I think that's possible, and that would be a smart business plan. If it wasn't for the fact that Katase has been quoted as basically saying that he wants this game to have the same visual impact as the first one had when that first came out on the PlayStation. being that wow factor. And I don't know. I think he's going to want the PS5 specs. He's going to want a brand new console. He's going to want, I guess you could have like a downgraded version on the PS4, but I feel like that would kind of take it away. But you would sell more copies.
Well, he doesn't. I mean, he may get a wow factor for it looking good, but you can't just get that. You can't get that revolutionary feel that you did the first time. FF7 was like a real piece of art in its way, in the how it just evolved the genre. It pretty much took RPGs and brought a more cinematic feel to them. So we already have these type of concepts, and we already have like beautiful, outstanding, out of these world looking games. And I'm sure Midgar is going to look fantastic, or any other area in the game. It's just going to be ultimately like, how are you going to make it stand the test of time in the long run?
Yeah, well, and that is the main point that I've always thought when I read that was, okay, like you could do that back then in the 90s because 3D games were still a new thing. You know, you brought in movie directors, or excuse me, like, I don't want to say movie directors, but people knowledgeable with films and how you set up sequences for cinematography and stuff like that. I mean, like you really pushed the boundaries of what video games were at that point in time. But it's 2018. Like, I mean, you can't. There's not really much room you can keep going in that direction. Now, if they brought, like I think you've said in the past, if they like retold the story in a way that was better, right? If they pushed the game past the original in terms of story, that would be cool. But I guess, you know, like you said before, that you wouldn't need a PS5 to do that. So,
yeah, I love how they hype it up so much. Again, I'm going to say it again. I've said it in the previous podcast. I'll say it here again. I would 100% just temper your expectations for this game. I'm sure it's going to be a good game, but
I'm sure it'll be a solid 8 out of 10.
No, I think it'll probably be higher than that.
You think so?
The thing is, the hype will never live to how the game will actually be. Like, people are going to think this is like a godsend from the heavens of Square Enix, the remake of Final Fantasy VII people have been waiting for since the PS3 tech demo. And I just don't think it'll be that next revolutionary product at all. I think it's going to be a great remake, and I think they're going to really put the effort into it to make it good. But, I mean, people are always going to find something to complain about. And I think the higher you decide to hype yourself with it, the more you're going to be disappointed with it.
Yeah. I think the game's going to be beautiful. I think the music's going to be great. I think the combat's going to piss me off because they're going to do something jackassery with it. And I think most people are going to like the first game because there's 2 more coming, and there's a lot of nostalgia with seeing Midgar in that new way, right? But I think by the time people get to the second or third game, you're going to start seeing these. The original was better, but you know,
FF7 1, FF7 2, and FF7 Cloud Returns.
Yeah, we don't know how long it's going to go, but anyways, so it was a good interview. Let me see exactly where that was. Who did that? So I don't even know how to say this. EDAMAME arcade channel. I don't know. Anyways, they do a lot of stuff like this. I think they have some affiliation with Square, but they're able to get these interviews with these people in Japan, notable people like this. And the actual interview is pretty interesting for people that are interested in some of the history of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, the Final Fantasy VII game. I mean, you have stuff like Sakaguchi talking about going to great lengths to reduce load time, even trying to get a millisecond down, like compiling the information in a way that would be the most efficient. And, Katase talking about this first time he heard the opening sequence of the Final Fantasy VII, music, and Nobuo complaining that he wanted Final Fantasy VII to be medieval. because he just had gotten used to the style in Final Fantasy VI. He felt like so. There's a lot of good information there. It was very, very entertaining, but you know, we can't.
Good job, Sakaguchi. The load times on FF7 are pretty great.
Well, you know, back in the day, he said he was laughing. He said he did the best he could for a disc, but I don't know. You know,
I mean, it went relatively fast for a PS1 RPG. I can certainly name other RPGs that have really slow load times.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really remember offhand the load times for Final Fantasy VII, but I don't remember it being a problem. So good job.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, so there you have it. Final Fantasy VII Remake was supposed to come out this year. Now we can all say that for the next 2 years until this game comes out.
Yep. See you guys in 2025 when the first episode comes out.
Yeah. So anyways, I'm kind of surprised that Sakaguchi thought that was a good question to ask. Like, because I'm pretty sure he probably knew it was supposed to come out. But anyways,
I wonder if he's allowed to say stuff now.
Yeah, I don't know. What I really wanted to hear was Sakaguchi's working on the game in some capacity. That would be good.
I was thinking he's just looking at his watch and he's like, in 3, 2, 1, NDA gone. God, working there sucks so much.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Anyways, but yeah. So let's move on. We have a comment from Dude Magai. So I'm going to go to this comment here, and we're just going to read this. It's fairly long, but it's some really good stuff. Let me get some water here before I start reading this, because I don't want cotton mouth while I'm trying to read this.
Yeah, for the sake of Hat's throat, make it as short and sweet as possible. I'm sure it's full of good info, but think of the poor man.
Yeah, well, the essential gist of this is basically some key points about why it may have been overall good for the JRPG genre in general. The fact that Final Fantasy stopped making such great games. So I'm just going to go through this as quickly as possible. He says, looking back, has the decline of Final Fantasy really been such a bad thing in the long run? Pretty common opinion among Final Fantasy fans that FF has struggled and declined overall in quality compared to the 90s. The Sakaguchi era, most of the mainline FF games after Final Fantasy X went through troubled development cycles. Failed to gain the same level of praise compared to previous games in the franchise. He goes on to say things about the online games and such. Okay, so then he goes on to say, after Final Fantasy X in 2001, many JRPG titles and franchises stepped up to pick up the slack and gained more mainstream attention. He says Fire Emblem came to North America in 2003 and is now a very popular JRPG franchise globally. The Persona series started gaining momentum. The Tales of series really took off, starting with Symphonia in 2004 and going forward. Dragon Quest games started getting released outside of Japan again. Dragon Quest VII in 2001. Dragon Quest VIII was the first ever official released in the PAL regions, he says he believes, and remakes the older DQ games released for DS and 3DS. And most recently, Falcom Legend of Heroes franchises are being localized more often and find a good size audience in the West. There are also many other games like Shadow Hearts, Disgaea, Skies of Arcadia, Rogue Galaxy, Golden Sun, Bravely Default, Radiant Historia, Xenoblade Chronicles, and now Octopath Traveler that got a lot more attention than they would have back in the 90s when the spotlight was still on the Final Fantasy franchise. The 90s had great JRPGs like Breath of Fire, Suikoden, Valkyrie Profile, etc. But with Final Fantasy dominating an already each genre at the time, these games didn't find a large enough audience to become competitors to Final Fantasy. Xenoblade Chronicles specifically, it was partially the relentless fan demand that eventually got the game released in the West. Would Operation Rainfall have had the same momentum if Final Fantasy 13 in 2010 was as well received as Final Fantasy 10 back in 2001? Fire Emblem, Dragon Quest, Persona, and Tales of, these are now very recognizable names in the JRPG genre that most fans are aware of and have probably tried at least one game from. These franchises really benefited from Final Fantasy's decline in the mid 2000s. Suddenly, there were a lot of Western JRPG fans that grew up with Final Fantasy but were no longer getting what they expected from that series. And because of this, these other franchises were able to start building the fan base that they have today. So now we have a more thirsty JRPG fan base that is more willing to try out the game's franchises. Final Fantasy is still a household name in 2018, but now has fans know and buy the competition regularly. This was not the case back in the 90s. He goes on to say today more games are localized for Western audiences. He points out several games as an examples. He says, so while the golden era of turn-based JRPGs might be over, we now have an era where the genre is more diverse in terms of audience, games, and successful developers. He goes on to give kind of an analogy. He says it's kind of like in the NBA. If you ask 20 people back in the 90s who their favorite player was, nearly all of them would likely have said Michael Jordan, because the Bulls were winning championships almost every year, and he was the leader of that team and the best player in the league. But if you ask 20 people today, they might give you 8 or more different answers. This is an overall good thing in my opinion, as now there are more people who are NBA fans, not just Jordan fans. So what do you think? Is the JRPG landscape better off now that the Final Fantasy series is no longer the beast that it used to be? Are you more willing to try out non-FF JRPGs today compared to back in the 90s? Was the decline of FF a blessing in disguise for fans and developers of the genre? Agree or disagree? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the topic. Now, I did skip a couple different parts, mainly for time constraints, but he has a really, really good case being made here. So I urge everyone to go to our YouTube channel and click on this past week's video titled, "Is this the N64 classic or is this just fantasy?" And you can go down to Dude McGuy's comment. So I've been talking a very long time, Eric, so let's get some alternate voices in here. What do you got? What do you think? I have my thoughts already.
I don't think
but
it matters at all.
You don't think it matters at all?
Doesn't matter at all. I don't think it would matter if Final Fantasy was still really good or really not good. Because the first put things on the table, it's very arguable if the Final Fantasy series has gotten better or worse. I mean, I can definitely agree that it feels like a decline in quality, but the only Final Fantasy to technically get a very bad rating, a low red score, is Final Fantasy 14 1.0. That is the only Final Fantasy that has a black mark on its mainline record. And as much as I don't like Final Fantasy 15, it's still praised by a lot of people. It's still pretty favorable with critics. Same with 13.
I think he was kind of referring to the fact that the older games are generally more well received by more people, right? Like if you go on to like Metacritic scores, like most of those Final Fantasy 10 and below are all like 90% well received. Final Fantasy 15 still well received, but it's like at an 80. Final Fantasy 13's at like an 80. I mean, most other gaming franchises, true. If your game got an 80 approval, that would be pretty good. But for the Final Fantasy game franchise, that feels low, you know.
Yeah,
but for other games, that's pretty high.
I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that the Final Fantasy series has it's very opinionated if it's actually gone in a decline or not.
Sure, I guess you got to say that. Yeah,
I just don't. I think if the 13 and 15 were highly praised today, I don't think it would have made a difference to these other games, because eventually down the line, there is a time when people go, I want more, but I want to see what other people have in store. Mm-hmm. And as video games started becoming more mainstream past the year 2000, people were craving more. There was more openness to competition. So naturally, competition came in more, and people discovered, hey, there's better things. I don't think there were too many people that went to themselves and said, you know what? I only want to play Final Fantasy. I don't want to play anything else but Final Fantasy. I have a hard time believing that there is a lot of people closed-minded like that. Because like even back then, my first RPGs were Final Fantasy 4 and well, Super Mario RPG and Final Fantasy 4 were essentially the first ones for me. And the first thing I thought in my mind is I just want to play more stuff like this. It wasn't like I just want to play Final Fantasy. Like I want to see what other games they haven't stored, and Secret of Mana comes and other turn-based RPGs. I mean, my head's foggy right to the second, but I know there's a ton of them on Super Nintendo.
Yeah,
but
actually,
I think PlayStation is where things started really opening up. Like people really like Legend of Dragoon. The Suikoden series was a classic. The Mana series with Legend of Mana, and things started opening up beyond Final Fantasy. So I think a lot of series got their got started, with already like during the before Final Fantasy went on its quote unquote decline.
Sure.
Because like I said, I agree, Final Fantasy's on decline, but I don't think it really started declining till 13.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, I think as much as I love 12, I do think it was like a slight hiccup here and there, but overall it was pretty great. But anyways, so I agree with you to an extent, but I do have some slight wrinkles where I kind of disagree a little bit. So like a lot of those games that were really popular and classic on the PlayStation, and we've talked about this in the past, like they didn't sell that well. Right? They just compared to the Final Fantasy games, they didn't sell that well. Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9 all sold several million copy. Well, 7's case 11 million, something like that. Something crazy. And a lot of these other RPGs barely, if at all, broke a million. But with that said, I think there is some truth to say that there were certain gamers that may have been like, I like RPGs, so I like what's popular. I like Final Fantasy. That's my comfort zone. I'm just sticking there. But the thing that I think would have happened, I think this would have happened eventually anyways. People would have branched out because, it takes longer and longer for these games to be made, right? When you're putting out a new Final Fantasy in a year and a half or 2 years, like it's not that unreasonable to wait for the next game, right? Or to go back and play some games in the back catalog. But when you have to wait 6 years for the next one to come out, I mean, dude, you can play that one. You can play you can play all the previous games. There's and you're still gonna have years of just waiting, and people are gonna be a little more adventurous. I mean, of course, there's always gonna be a lot of people like yourself that are gonna be naturally curious to begin with, but I do think a lot of that had to come down with the fact that the games were just taking longer to be made. So even if Final Fantasy 13 was a 10 out of 10 game, and it was just across the board, critics were like, this is amazing. Square did it again, just nothing but praise.
Yeah, it's by human nature. People want more.
Yeah, but I mean, even if that was the case, you're not going to see Final Fantasy 15 for, 10 years? So what are you're going to keep playing Final Fantasy 13 for 10 years? No, you're going to play other things. So I think it just really comes down to how often the games come out. I think that's probably the biggest culprit, regardless of the quality of the games.
Yeah, and even then, when people get even during the SNES PS1 era, after they beat the game, they're like, "All right, so do I just sit here till the new one comes out next year?" It's like, no, people naturally crave more. So when they beat something like, say, Final Fantasy 7 or 8, they're like, well, what else can I play now? So wait till Final Fantasy 9. It's like, oh, hey, look, there's Chrono Cross here. Like, why don't I try that? And
yeah,
people naturally crave more. It's human tendency.
Sure. I do think he makes an interesting analogy with the NBA with in the 90s, people really only talked about Michael Jordan. I don't know if that was true. I was a little kid. I remember hearing a lot about Michael Jordan, but I wasn't really into basketball then. But that is I think a useful analogy you could bring up about video games. I think the difference being is just in the 90s, the player base was a lot smaller too. And, Final Fantasy was the first JRPG to really hit mainstream in the West. So I think that makes sense why you have that 5 or 6 year kind of window where Final Fantasy is just murdering it, while other JRPGs are kind of lesser known. But yeah, like you said, it's only a matter of time before, you know, people are going to play all the old ones and they're just going to be looking for something else, and, you know, they're going to get a little experimental. I don't know if all these great games that he mentioned that came out after Final Fantasy X, I don't know if I can honestly say those games wouldn't have come out anyways if Final Fantasy XII came out 2 years later instead of 6. I think they still would have came out. I still think Rogue Galaxy still would have came out. I still think, you know, Shadow Hearts. I still think all these games would have came out. I mean, I can see the point being made that, well, without Final Fantasy coming out every 2 years, they don't have to compete with that, you know, Uber franchise. But I still think those games would have came out, and they would have came out at a time that was most convenient for them. And, you know, I don't know. I see what he's trying to say. I'm just not sure the impact was as large as we'd like. But I do think they're really good points.
I just don't think the quality really matters. I mean, even on top of that, you know, everyone is super excited, and like when the new Final Fantasy comes out, it's not like it's leveled with other franchises. I know when we visit like Discord sites and stuff, you know, when new Final Fantasy comes, it's like, you know, everyone's going crazy, and, you know, the Discord's eerily quiet because everyone's out playing Final Fantasy. You know, with Persona games, they are a little niche, so I kind of see where he comes from with it. Like, you know, Final Fantasy is a big deal when a new numbered title comes out. So
yeah, I mean, I see what he's saying. If Final Fantasy 16 comes out at the same time as a new Tales game, I'm gonna buy Final Fantasy 16.
Yeah,
right.
Which makes me think that Final Fantasy is still the top dog, you know, RPG in the West. It's my only argument is that I think these franchises would have grown and been just as successful, rather if Final Fantasy was good or bad. I will say though that if Final Fantasy still keeps showing the quality that 13 and 15 did, I think over time people will start catching on more and more and start favoring more the other franchises over Final Fantasy. I don't think we've gotten to that point yet, especially since 13 and 15, I would say at best, are split between people.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally find a ton of faults with both titles, but I mean, but there's clearly a fan base of people who enjoy them. So
yeah, I mean, you know, they're not the worst games in the world, but I guess compared to some of the other games in the franchise, it's hard to hold them up to the same caliber for everyone. But yeah, I mean, but to his point though, I do think it's really cool that all these games kind of inspired, or whatever, however you want to say it, ended up exploding onto the scene after, you know, in the 2000s, like Golden Sun, and then you know, Rogue Galaxy and Xenoblade Chronicles, and even now we have Octopath Traveler and such. But I think that's really, really cool that a lot of those games were inspired by Final Fantasy, and like we got to go experience the same formula in a different way. But I still think those games would have came about regardless. So
yeah, I mean, it's no doubt that Final Fantasy has inspired so many other RPG franchises, like directly or indirectly.
Yeah, for sure. So anyways, that's my thoughts on that, and sounds like we're in agreement there. So yeah, good topic though, Doom Guy. I really appreciate your comments on here. It gives us something interesting to talk about, not the same topics in a different way. So really appreciate that, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Let's go on to Cerez Cypher. Actually, you know what? We're gonna talk about him later. We're just gonna go on to our Silver Music Box, who's asking about our favorite JRPG soundtracks. We want to kind of split up the longer comments. He says he's been listening to our podcast as of late, and it's really good. That said, I have a question for you both. What are your favorite JRPG soundtracks from non-Square games?
Non-Square games.
I forgot that part.
All right, oh now my God. A challenge.
I was like, oh man, I'm gonna have to be mentioning, like, you know, 5 Final Fantasy games, Chrono Trigger. So I was thinking in particular a series that I don't really like that much, but I love the soundtrack. The Persona series has a great soundtrack in general. In particular, Persona 4 and 5, I really, really enjoy. I listen to the soundtrack probably once a week. So to me, that's pretty good. Xenoblade Chronicles, also phenomenal soundtrack. I really, really enjoy that soundtrack.
Yes, that definitely. Most definitely Xenoblade.
Yeah, but I mean, that's got people working on it that worked on Square Games, but you didn't say we couldn't do that.
But Xenoblade 1, though. Xenoblade X's soundtrack is... it's like half of it's good, and the other half it's like, my God, put the mute on.
Yeah. A newer game. Well, never mind. I was gonna say Octopath Traveler had a great soundtrack, but that's a Square Enix game.
Yeah, Arc the Lad has an amazing soundtrack. All games.
Does it?
Yeah, all the games have a really good soundtrack. I could listen to it all day. It's like a very upbeat, exciting type soundtrack.
See, I still have to go through that franchise and play it some more, but cool. Yeah, let me think here. So we got that.
The Tales series has pretty decent music, but sometimes I feel like it's a lot of the same thing. Like I think I like the battle themes in particular with the Tales series.
Yeah, I would say
Historia,
that for sure.
Another fantastic
Alice,
soundtrack by one of my favorite composers, Yoko Shimomura, along with Xenoblade 1. Radiant Historia has an amazing soundtrack. Then let's see.
I really like the Shadow Hearts soundtrack. It's by Yasunori Mitsuda and another guy from Square.
Golden Sun has a great
Golden
soundtrack.
Sun has a good soundtrack for sure.
Good. I mean, Venus Lighthouse is probably one of the greatest themes I've ever heard.
Yeah. I mean, technically, let me see. He said, let me look at his specific comment again. He said non-Square games. So you could mention games that were made by Enix prior to their merger.
I know what he means. I'm trying to be fair here. I won't try to loophole it.
Because I feel like you just want to be like Dragon Quest. Yeah.
I know this is a mobile theme or a mobile game, but Terra Battle has a really good sound.
Yes, Terra Battle has. But see, that's okay.
Yomatsu, not Square. It's Mistwalker.
It's Sakaguchi. Lost Odyssey had a pretty good soundtrack. Last Story I actually liked a lot better than Lost Odyssey's. As far as soundtrack goes,
I like the art direction in Last Story more.
Yeah,
definitely. I don't know. I think we just named a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I did not actually notice the non-Square games part until I just looked at it now. So,
Fire Emblem has a pretty good soundtrack.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I feel like games in general usually have pretty good soundtracks because when you're composing for games, you really have to design it from the standpoint of, hey, like somebody's going to listen to this for like hours, So, I mean, obviously there's games with bad soundtracks, but I can name a few.
I remember Legend of Dragoon had a pretty fun soundtrack, like the boss battle theme, like that gets you pumped up.
For sure. Yeah. So, anyways, there you go. I like. Just occurred to me. I like the Xenosaga soundtrack as well. So, all of them.
I was about to say Xenogears, but Squaresoft.
Yeah. Phantasy Star 4. I do not like that soundtrack. I'll throw one out there I don't like. So, just to know.
I don't think I've ever known the Phantasy Star series for its soundtrack.
I generally just don't like it. I like to keep the music off because it's annoying to me, but I realize some people might really enjoy it, so I'll just leave that out there for y'all to get mad. Anyways, let's move on to our next topic. Really appreciate that questionnaire. Really made us think and ponder.
I really want to play Phantasy Star 4. I want that Genesis collection to come out soon.
Yeah, has there been an update with that?
It's supposed to come out this winter. And since we're about 2.5 months roughly left of this year, it's supposed to come out soon.
Cool. I will pick it up. Definitely can get down on that before Kingdom Hearts.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So Stress Cypher, he gives his thoughts on let me get the screen up here. Our comment last week about Xenoblade Chronicles, in which I think it was Jam Gamecast. He said he actually did not like the first one, at least the art style of Xenoblade Chronicles. He actually preferred the anime style of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Mm-hmm. And I think I said something like not liking Xenoblade is a sin, the first one. And Sort of Cypher is going to kind of give his comments why he didn't think or why he's not a huge fan of this game. But he's also bringing up a lot of points that he says he enjoyed from hearing our discussion videos. So if anybody wants some more background information on this comment, you can go to our YouTube page and just look for the Xenoblade Chronicles discussion. We had a hour and a half discussion on it. It's one of my favorite podcast episodes. It was really good stuff. Eric goes in depth about him being involved in Operation Rainfall and really good stuff. So anyways, let's jump into this. So he says, not liking Xenoblade 1 is a sin. I have to disagree. I think Xenoblade 1 is overrated. I probably would say I like the game, but I'm a pretty thin margin from not liking it. I watched your other video discussing Xenoblade 1 in depth. Good video. I liked the discussion, and I found the vast majority of observations you all listed about the game were the same things I felt about it when I was playing it. But I think the reason I feel differently about it overall is that some of the things you listed as criticisms but felt they were minor issues were things that really bothered me. I spent so much time on inventory management with the task of comparing gear, being so much work with gear varying on several different stats and having so much of it drop from enemies that it would fill up the inventory. I hated that I felt forced to use Shulk, Orion, and Sharla as my party, due to the mechanics of battle being designed like an MMO systems with tank, healer, and DPS roles. And Ryan being the only obvious tank and Sharla being the only straight-up healer, and Shulk having massive advantages against mechons or against boss attacks.
Okay, can I stop you there for a sec?
Yeah, go ahead.
There was a second tank in that game. His name was Dunban, and he excelled in evasion tanking. If you put more evasion gems on him and build him up for that, he is someone that almost never gets hit. So it's really cool to switch out Dunban and Ryan depending on the situation. If the enemy has a very high accuracy or hits very fast, then you definitely want to get Ryan who can take the hits. But if it's something you can properly evade, you want to bring in Dunban instead.
So I know what he's talking about because the game starts off and you pretty much along the way within the first 10 hours or so, you basically have that's your party until you get more party members in your group, right? So the game has to give you an option to have a tank and a healer. You have to have that or else the game's basically not playable, or they can make it super easy, right? So when they add new players or characters into the game, it's not immediately apparent that if you put some work into these other characters, they're actually quite useful. So I went through the same experience. I got Dunban and I was like, you know what? I'm done with Ryan. I'm going to stick Dunban in there. I stuck Dunban in there and I played with him for 6 hours and I felt like I felt like I was dying all the time. Then I stuck Ryan back in there and life was gravy. He was just taking all the damage and it was just easier. But like you said, a lot of those other characters are kind of designed to be utilized if you're willing to put some thought into how you want to build the characters. So I think both of you are kind of right.
Well, even from the beginning, when you first get Dunman, you can swap him out with Ryan and put in evasion gems, and he's good to go. But I will absolutely agree that I absolutely hate heavy inventory management. I absolutely hate dealing with menus for a long extended period of time, and I absolutely agree with him on that. And Xenoblade Chronicles 2 took that to such an extent that it was just grossing me out.
Yeah.
I didn't want to deal with any of this, and it just kept putting more and more on me. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah. I think that's one of the biggest things that I did not like about the first game is the inventory management, because while I was going through that game, there were parts of my week where I would just get really busy, but I wanted to continue making progress on the game. So I would have an hour on like a Wednesday night sectioned off, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna play the game for an hour that day, try to get a couple extra hours in during the week, so then when I have more time over the weekend, I can plow through some more of the game. And I would sit down for my hour of playing the game, and I would go to the shop, and I would spend nearly the entire hour just combing through my inventory. Can I sell this? Can I not sell this? Okay, let me sell this. Okay, let me compare this. And like, if you spend that much time kind of optimizing all your gear, it really paid off, and it could keep you from having to grind for hours. But it was a little overwhelming to have to do that much inventory management. It was very, very fatiguing for sure.
Monolith Soft needs a serious crash course on creating depth through simplicity, because Xenoblade Chronicles 2 just gave me a headache. It wasn't necessarily that it was difficult to deal with, it's that it just kept stacking more and more on you. It wanted you to do more than what the game was originally offering, more near towards the earlier part of it. And I just didn't feel like that micromanaging everything anymore. That's one of the reasons I stopped playing it. The other one was a really poorly made stage design / map design.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the biggest reasons I appreciate the Final Fantasy series is because of inventory management. I feel like in general they do it fairly well. Usually they'll have an option where equip like defense or aggression, or whatever the case. And like usually when you buy stuff, at least I remember for Final Fantasy 12, when you buy something, you choose who you want it to equip. That person equips it, and then it asks you if you want to sell the previous item that they had. Right? And then there's all these different places where it's like, okay, this is the stuff you can sell. This is a separate tab. This is stuff that's used for crafting or whatever. Okay. Like it's very organized, and like you don't have to worry about like Googling every item to find out if you're going to sell some magical item that you're going to want later, or, whatever the case. So
yeah, both Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest excel pretty well, and just get what you need done in the menu and just get out and get back to the game.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's intentionally designed that way also. They don't want people just sticking around in the menus all day. Just put in, equip what you need, equip what spell or ability on you, then get right on out of there. If I feel like if I'm spending more time than I should in a menu screen, I personally think the developers did something wrong.
Yeah. Let's go back to his comment though, for sure.
Yes, he has more comment.
He goes on to say, I tried using and very much wanted to use other characters, but they always felt significantly less effective. And Eric, I know you had your point about it's the way you optimize them. But he says, and the game was difficult enough that you can't afford to neglect those advantages. Then he goes on to say, the thing that bothered me the most about the game, though, was something that actually wasn't brought up in our other video. It's one particular story scene, and he's going to attempt to describe it without spoilers. He says, I think it's when a character tries to kill people, then that character gets defeated in the fight, and that character is still powerful, will recover, and is not in a position where they can be imprisoned and make them no longer a threat. And those that fought in self-defense have one who strongly argues for sparing the life of the attempted murderer. That is a trope that I am tired of. To top it off, in that scene, the attempted murderer is immediately removed as a threat by random circumstances outside the defender's control, keeping the defender's hands clean so that the writers can have their cake and eat it too. There's a complex moral issue there that's being grossly oversimplified. It's as if the lesson they want you to take from that scene is that this innocent side is the correct one. You can count on fate to immediately solve the problem with no negative consequences for anyone else. That scene was a turning point in my evaluation of the game where I wasn't on its side anymore. He has one last positive thing to say, but I know what scene he's talking about.
I don't remember on top of my head.
Yeah,
if it got described in detail to me, I might remember it.
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, exactly like he said, right? I'm not going to spoil anything, but there's an evil character. They've been evil the whole game. They did lots of bad stuff. They murdered lots and lots of people. You finally defeat this person, and like the third time you fight them, or something. I don't know if it was the third time. It was one of the multiple times you fight them, and you know the person's clearly in the state where you could just kill them. One of the characters wants to kill them. Another character says, "Don't do that. That's not who we are. We don't do this." And they're like, "Okay."
That's in all freaking JRPGs, man.
He's like, "Okay, I'm not gonna do it." And then like the character you weren't gonna kill, like something comes down and like pushes them off a cliff or something. And it's like, oh, they died anyways. You know, it's just like
it's a valid complaint, but at the same time, I've just seen it so many times. It's hard to it's hard to care that they do that at this point.
Honestly, I do remember having the same thought when I did see that sequence, because I was kind of like, I feel like you should just kill this guy. I feel like the other person has a really good point. This person killed millions of people, and I'm not for murdering people. I'm not for killing people, but this person is clearly like a threat, and if you're not going to kill them, you at least need to imprison them or like remove them from this the equation here, because they keep becoming a problem, and you're trying to do something that's very, very important. Yeah, that is a trope in JRPGs. I really don't like it when they do that stuff. Frankly, I've seen it done in the limited Dragon Quest games I've played, where sometimes like somebody who's done something extremely bad like is not being held accountable. And I guess it's just something you get used to. But I think that's something he's kind of brought up, is that he's seen it so many times that it's hard for him to, it just frustrates him. Whereas in your case, you've seen it so many times.
Yeah. Remember when Vader and I think General Tarkov, I think his name was, blew up Alderaan that had billions of people on it? Yeah. At the end, it's like, I see the good in you, Father. It's like, were you there in the first movie when I blew up an entire planet of people?
Yeah, it's like, that was. I'm glad you saw that was bad, but
maybe I didn't pull the trigger, but I sure as hell didn't stop it.
This was pretty awful what you just did. Yeah, yeah. A lot of games do that, and I honestly, it is very, in my opinion, poor storytelling when because it's like nobody would honestly have that opinion. It's not a real opinion.
It would be more realistic to look into the psyche of, what it means to keep this person alive, or maybe see like more of the consequences to their actions, as opposed to like letting the hero or what be right about it. It's like, let that be another mistake for them.
This reminds me, and I'm going to say this, of a Star Trek Voyager episode. And
God, Star Trek. I'm just kidding. It's fine.
Yeah, there's this character, and he's basically he's a serial killer, and he's on the ship. Somehow he made it in the Starfleet. He's a serial killer, and the whole thing is he's got some kind of mental disorder that they can't cure, and he's going around killing people on the ship. And once they figure out who it is, they're trying to figure out what to do with this person, because they're lost 70,000 light years away. What are they going to do? They can't, they're not going to murder. They have two options. They can either murder him, put him on like a planet somewhere, like a deserted planet, because they don't want to put him in the populace with some other alien species and like kill these people, or they can imprison him for the rest of his life on a starship in a brig. And it's kind of interesting. They kind of go into it a little bit, not quite as much as I'd like, but it would have been, just to not leave everyone on a cliffhanger. They ended up deciding to keep him in the brig for the rest of his life, but and then he's never seen again for like 4 seasons, which is the problem with that show. But anyways, so it would be cool if that would be explored more, these serious concepts in JRPGs. That's one of the biggest things I don't like about sometimes with JRPGs is they just casually gloss over these more darker elements, whereas games like Final Fantasy
that's what
don't always do that.
JRPGs get criticized for in general, is it's just constant use of tropes.
Yeah,
that's definitely one of the big criticisms of the genre in general.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and the thing is, tropes aren't necessarily a bad thing if they're executed well. So.
Oh yeah. Definitely. But it's easier to spot out the trope when it's not well done.
Yeah. But anyways, very good thoughts on that. In general, I pretty much agree with everything you said. I think it's just the amount of weight, like you pointed out. Whereas to me, it's a little more of a minor criticism. Whereas your personal preference, it was a bigger issue. But yeah, just to clarify, if you dislike Xenoblade Chronicles 1, anyone out there, it is not a sin. I was joking.
It's
But
not a perfect game, but I still find it probably the best one during that generation, especially the generation of when there were so many lackluster JRPGs to the point that I felt like I was ready to just abandon the genre in general at the
yeah.
time.
Well, what I like about that game in general is just like you said, like the level of the fact of when it came out and then the level of detail that went into it. You just don't get games made like that anymore, or very often. I mean, the director, he was quoted as saying that game is literally like 100% of what he wanted in the game got in the game. I mean, that doesn't happen very often anymore. So for that reason alone, I think it's definitely worth picking up. But whether or not you'll like it, yeah, it depends on your personal preference.
Wonder if he got everything he wanted in the second game.
And more. Well, apparently the DLC didn't make it. Although that the way they conducted it, I think that's probably the way you should do DLC. So,
I mean that's not DLC. That's an expansion.
Like another game, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We have BioPhoenix. He's commenting about the fact that it's a Halloween time frame. He says, "I'm also on the waiting side of things when it comes to rumors and stuff. Resonance of Fate had some cool ideas, but overall, I had no idea what I was doing through the game, so I ended up dropping it, which is a shame since it's a Trius game. I do like the art for Xenoblade 2, but it's not my favorite because I mostly prefer the old school anime art like 80s and 90s. But for a newer anime art, I think it looks good for that. Here is a question I got. Since it's October, do you think we should get more horror-themed RPGs? Stuff with the same tone as Parasite Eve, Shadow Hearts, and Sweet Home on Famicom. What do you think, Eric? I would like to see more horror-themed RPGs.
Maybe something spooky or with an interesting story, mystery type deal. But I think if you try to really go like full on horror or something like, say, maybe Silent Hill ish type of deal,
yeah,
I think you're immediately taken out of the experience when you are being presented in some RPG like fashion, because then it becomes when the mechanics conflict with the immersion. Because in a horror, when you watch like a horror movie, you're always in a large state of suspense and tension. And like when you're traveling around the city in Silent Hill, you're always like very timid, you're very cautious, you're scared that something may like pop up or whatnot. And I think like if something pops up at you and you just go to an RPG like screen and be like do you attack him? Do you run away? I think it immediately takes you out of the immersion. I think having full control of your character and mechanics to the point that you don't even have to think about it when you are playing the game helps the tension a lot more. I think that's really why you haven't seen many horror themed ones. Now, that isn't to say that you can't do something like maybe say like a Castlevania RPG.
Yeah, I think more like in the tone of like horror, right? So maybe like a zombie type thing or like a apocalyptic thing where it might be a scary environment or with like vampires or something like that, but maybe not typical horror film, I would guess, where, like you said, you have something popping out the window every 5 seconds. It's hard to do that for 50 hours, keeping the player on suspense in an RPG. But I think that's the way you'd have to do it, or go the Castlevania route, like you said, where it's very medieval and very classic horror, but it's not going to actually scare you, just kind of like the tone of it, I think would be the way to go. I think he brings up Parasite Eve, which is kind of a good starting point for that, probably. Just tonally what you want to go for.
Yeah, if you were to do that, you would have to make the RPG elements as minimal. In my opinion, I think it needs to be as minimal as possible. to the point that you're not even thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I know sometimes people consider Shadow Hearts to be like a horror genre RPG, and like it's not like it's. I've always kind of took issue with that because it's not like it's not a scary game. The game isn't made to scare you. It's just in a setting where there are ghosts, there are vampires, there are demons. You know, there's all sorts of witchcraft going on, but it's not like you're not being scared, right? You're not being horrified by playing it. It's just the setting is kind of Halloween-ish, I guess you could say, right?
Now, I can think of one game where I felt it was like very creepy and I felt very uncomfortable the whole time, but not in a they were doing something like disgusting
This guy.
type of
Oh.
uncomfortable. But it was kind of like I was kind of like me being immersed in it so much that like I really felt like I was in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and like it felt like I felt like I was always in a state of uncomfort because I never really felt like I knew or the character knew or felt where he was, at least at the beginning of it. Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne.
Okay. I've heard that's a kind of a scary toned game.
It's a
I still
scary
haven't played
toned
it.
game, but I wouldn't consider really a horror. But the demonic nature of the game gives you that sense of uncomfort all the time.
Hmm.
To an extent, the other games also like 1, 2, and 4. 1 and 2 are older games, so it's kind of harder. I'm
Sure.
sure at the time it was, but uh, Shin Megami Tensei 4 does have that creepy factor into it when you discover like the underground Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
But that one felt like more like you were patrollers, like discovering things while you're going about. You felt like you still felt like you had like a sense of power, uh, investigating down there, like being like criminal investigator type of deal, like soldiers. But like Nocturne really was like you're just this one simple person, like in this whole world that's like after apocalypse, monsters have taken over. Everything is just like so demonic looking. Like
Yeah.
it's like it's creepy. It creeps you out in a way. So I think stuff like more stuff in that type of style,
Mm-hmm.
I think does well for the horror scene. If you're trying to do an RPG, try try to do your best to immerse your audience as much as you can, and it doesn't have to be like a pop scare or anything really psychological. Just something that really immerses someone and gives them that same type of feeling of being uncomfortable but satisfied with the product at the same time.
Yeah. Now that I think about it, Final Fantasy 15, I think they did try to go with like kind of like a horror theme for their chapter 13, right?
Yeah, but they like changed the genre of the game to do it.
It was very like strange all of a sudden, but
Out of
yeah.
nowhere, it became a horror game.
Yeah. And then it returned to normal after, yeah. Oh. But anyways, so there's some experimentation, but I would be game for somebody to give it a shot. See what they come up with. I'm all about people experimenting. So if people stuck to what people thought were possible, you'd never have any kind of uh
Nothing's impossible.
yeah. That's what I'm getting at. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, we got our last question here. Comment from Leanne. She says, I'm going to get hate for this, but I honestly don't want an N64 Classic right now. I want a Game Boy Classic first. If we get a Game Boy Classic, we're still getting an N64 Classic later. It doesn't negate or interrupt the home system classic line, but if we get N64 first, I think it's safe to say that the classic line is strictly for home systems. My other motive for wanting to wait on the N64 is that let's say it comes out this year or next year, they'll do GameCube Classic in 2020 and Wii in 2021. The classic line would end right there as we're still in Generation 8, and it wouldn't make sense to make Wii U or Switch Classic. Why rush when you can take your time?
Leanne, you're not alone.
Yeah.
I
Well,
take a
let me
Game
make.
Boy over an N64.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that I think it's going to be a while. I think probably past 2020 until we get a GameCube Classic because that's when games start getting really, really big.
I think it might stop with N64 to tell you the truth.
Yeah, I think maybe in like 10 or 15 years we might get a PS2 Classic or something like that. But
Those games are so big to put on a singular device.
yeah,
Like it'd be like 2-3 gig, 2 to 5 gig easily per game.
yeah. So you might have like 3 games.
Yeah, or a bigger card in
Or they
there.
just start putting like a web store on it, and it's like, oh, this is what we had before.
I think the reason the Game Boy edition hasn't been released yet, I think it might be a hard product to sell, surprisingly, because you have to market it correctly that it's not a new handheld, that this thing is built specifically to play just a few games.
Well, if you think about it, one of the novelties of an N64 Classic, for example, or we should go with the SNES Classic or the NES Classic, which have already been released, is how much smaller they are, right, than their original system. And the Game Boy Pocket was already pretty small. You know, it was pretty much had enough space for the buttons and the screen. And it was pretty thin. I mean, I guess they could make them thinner. So I think they'd have to do something completely unique to really accommodate for that. And I'm trying to think, but I remember seeing a news story a couple of weeks ago about Nintendo patenting like a phone case that looks like it comes over your smartphone, and it's got like a Game Boy like buttons on it, and then it's got an opening for like the screen. Now they just patented it. There's nothing saying that they're actually making that. But if they were to do some kind of Game Boy Classic, I would imagine they could do something like that where it plugs into the bottom of your phone, you know, and then it just you can play it on your smartphone. I mean, I don't know. Maybe
That would
something
be
like
cool.
that.
But I think if they did a remodel, I think it would be something similar to the Game Boy Pocket or the Game Boy Color, which are
Just a re-release.
significantly smaller than the original Game Boy.
I mean, it might be pretty popular if it's like $30 or something. I mean, I don't know how much they would cost.
But I
If
think
you
the
have all
color
those,
scheme would definitely be the classic Game Boy.
you think so?
Mm-hmm.
You don't think they'd go with the color?
No, because the Game Boy is more nostalgic.
I don't know, man. I don't know. Like, it's hard for me to say because, I mean, granted, this is Nintendo, but I would have said the PlayStation Classic was going to have the analog stick controller, and they went with
Oh
the
man,
classic controller. So
have you
even though the analog's better, so
have you held the original Game Boy? Those things are giant bricks.
yeah, I know they're the newer versions were way better. Um, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think
No, because you want Pokemon Blue, you want Pokemon Yellow and Red, and I mean, I guess you wouldn't have all three Pokemons on there. You'd have one Pokemon on there, but
I think they would base it. My guess is actually I think they would base it off the Game Boy Pocket, and they would put a backlight on it, and the plastic will probably feel maybe a tad cheaper because it's a classic tool, not an actual handheld like
yeah,
successor or anything like that. So, like I said, I think it's harder to sell something like that because it's a very confusing product. And but the console classics are pretty straightforward. It's like here's a bunch of games from the olden times to put it on here, but you have to strongly convey to your market, be like this Game Boy Classic, it is only for these certain games we have on here. You can't do anything else to it.
it would be cool if they made a Game Boy Classic that kind of functions similar to a Switch. That you went home and put it on a dock or something, and like suddenly it was like playing on your TV, and then you took it off the dock and you took it with you. Or you could use. I guess you'd have to figure something out because I was thinking you could use the Game Boy Pad as like the controller, but just having that ability to dock it and then play it on your TV and then play it in bed, and the battery life would probably be phenomenal. I would imagine. You know,
It's so
like
sad that Nintendo only has NES games for the
yeah,
online services. It'd be so great
they're
if
like
they put
they're like
Game Boy and
dripping
Game
them
Boy
out
Colors
too.
on games on
Yeah,
there. I would love to play Link's Awakening on the Switch again.
yeah.
So
I
much.
think that's the biggest thing is I would prefer that these games to be just released on the Switch. I would be fine with that. It would be
Yeah,
cool. Yeah.
I mean, I think the Game Boy one I would definitely buy over the console one. So I don't own any of the console classics because There they are. I already have them.
Yeah.
They may not be in the beautiful, crisp HD resolution, but I like them classic, so that's fine with me. That they're not HD.
Yep, for sure. So, anyways, I don't know if they would actually do a Game Boy. I'm sure they'll try it, a Game Boy Classic.
I think one will eventually come in some form.
Yeah, I just don't know how it's. Some tells me they're going to try to do something cheesy, like be like, oh, look at this, the Game Boy Classic can be played in the Nintendo shop. It's all digital games, which that's fine. That's exactly what I'd want, But I don't know. But if they could come up with something that would be, I don't know how you can't really make the game. I guess you could make it a little bit smaller, but it still has to look like a Game Boy, So I think they just make the exact same model, basically of the Game Boy Pocket, just a re-release with, like you said, a backlight, better battery life. You don't have to use AAA batteries, and a bunch of games on it. I guess that might actually do really well.
Yeah, I'm sure there wouldn't be any back piece. I think there would be like a charging cable, like a port for a charging cable, a headphone port, the device itself. I don't think there'll even be a slot for cartridges. I think it'll just be everything will be built in. I'll have a little user interface that you can pick between which game you want. Have your save and load states, and that's it.
Now I'm thinking about it, I actually really like this idea, Leon. I think it'd be great, and then I would buy a Game Boy Advance Classic and a DS Classic. Well, I don't know about DS Classic. I don't know if they'd do that, but yeah, really, really, really good idea.
Yeah, I'm on board for it.
For sure. But anyways, let me make sure we didn't miss any topics here. I think we got everything. Yep. Fantastic. All right. So that wraps it up for this week. Next week we'll be back. And if y'all have any other suggestions for topics, we really, really appreciate it this week. Leave them in the comments and we'll be sure to talk about it next week. Other than that, we'll talk to y'all when we see you.
All
Later,
right,
guys.
Take care.